My name is Nichelle Harriott. I am the moderator for you guys today. I work at Beyond Pesticides. I am their Science and Regulatory Director. And before I introduce our first speaker, let me just give you a background on the work Beyond Pesticides is doing on pollinator protection. Beyond Pesticides started work on pollinators maybe 6-7 years ago. Actively, I should say, working on pollinators. And we joined with the Center for Food Safety and Pesticide Action Network and a couple other allies across the country to draw greater awareness to pollinator declines and the impact of pesticides on pollinators, and not just honeybees, but all pollinators, including birds and other beneficial organisms. Thus far, it's a large coalition of NGO groups working on this issue. And I don't know if you guys heard, last summer, the president issued a presidential memorandum directing federal agencies to take some action on pollinator protection, what we call the White House Task Force. And we are awaiting a decision from them any day now on what their recommendations will be to reverse pollinator decline and support pollinator health. Beyond Pesticides also has a grassroots campaign with Center for Food Safety called Be Protective, and I think there are some materials in here and also outside on our grassroots work. There are several local towns and counties across the country that are working on passing pollinator protection resolutions, ordinances, or policies that would restrict the uses of the chemical neonicotinoids, which have been linked in the science to play a very vital role in the decline of honeybees and other bees. So very exciting work going on both at the federal level and at the state and local level. Larissa, our first speaker today from the Center for Food Safety, will give us an overview on what's been happening at the federal and local level and why we should be concerned and how we should take action. Our second speaker, we just heard at the panel, and he will, Richard, he will give us some more discussion on the study and the work that they're doing up at Harvard. And our last speaker is a beekeeper from Florida, Bill Rhodes. He would sort of talk to us about his experiences as a beekeeper and what he's been observing with his bees and pesticides. So I'm just going to keep it brief. And this is a very informal session. I would like for us to have the speaker speak first and then answer questions afterwards. So first up is Larissa Walker from the Center for Food Safety.
Like Nichelle said, I'm just going to kind of go over the issues with neonics, which many of you have heard about throughout this conference already, but kind of just go into it a little bit deeper. I'm based in our DC office at Center for Food Safety. I'm our pollinator campaign director. We have offices in San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, and Hawaii. And our DC office gives me a lot of opportunity to work on this issue. So everyone's heard a lot about the bees issue recently. It's been making headlines for the last several years. Neonicotinoids making headlines as well as the new DDT killing the natural world. But for whatever reason, it keeps being discussed as this sort of mystery. What's happening? And one of the reasons that the media tends to not just focus directly on the issues articulately in some ways, because there are a lot of factors affecting bees. Pesticides, which we'll be talking about today, is definitely one of them, and it's a big issue. But there are a lot of other factors affecting bees as well, and there have been for some time. Habitat loss, parasites like the varroa mite, which is discussed a lot in the media, poor nutrition from a lack of good forage, and extreme weather conditions from climate change. And because there are all of these factors, they're also working together. There's synergistic effects. There's a lot of overlap between them. So when bees are exposed to pesticides, they're going to be more susceptible to parasites and pathogens. If they don't have good nutrition, their immunity might not be as good as well, and the pesticides will have greater impacts. But the pesticide issue is really important because it's the one factor that we can do something about immediately. Whereas all of these other issues, some of them are out of our control and others are much more challenging to take on. And the pesticide issue, we can and should do something about. So neonicotinoids, we call them neonics for short. It's a tongue twister. They're a class of insecticides. They affect bees at very, very low doses. They're able to kill bees outright. And they're systemic. They're this new class of pesticides that was introduced in the early 1990s. We never had pesticides that were doing what neonics do before this. And because they're systemic, there's a little illustration there to show they're taken up into the plant and then expressed in all of the plant's tissue. So whether it's the pollen and nectar or getacean droplets on the dew droplets on the leaves, they permeate into the soil. So they're definitely incorporated into every part of the plant and also the nearby area. And they're extremely toxic to bees. I think we saw a lot of visuals already throughout the forum, but they can have this is an example of an acute kill impacting bees directly from a very high exposure to neonics. One of the recent reports, up to 10,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT. And another example of just how powerful these chemicals are and how serious the impacts can be on bees. This is an incident that happened in near Portland, Oregon, Wilsonville, Oregon, at a Target shopping center parking lot in July of 2013. Is Lisa in the room? No. And we have a lot of colleagues who are near this area and we're very involved in this tragic incident. But basically, pesticide applicators came in, treated these blooming linden trees in the Target parking lot because blooming linden trees can leak sap on people's cars, and that would be tragic. And so they treated the trees, and within hours there were just piles of dead bumblebees littered across the parking lots, trembling if they weren't dying yet, because that's a symptom of these neurotoxins. And it was estimated that about 50,000 bumblebees were killed as a result of this incident. And that's a really high number. And honeybee colonies, a really healthy hive would have 40 or 60,000 honeybees, but in a bumblebee hive, it's about 200. So to have 50,000 killed just in this one. And we are only able to see this because it's a parking lot. Normally when we have bee kills like this that aren't in an area where people are walking by, seeing them with children screaming, we might not notice them. But another really important factor to this issue is that there are effects on bees that aren't just acute. They aren't just killing the bees outright. And that's these sublethal or chronic effects that we've heard a lot about already. And so what are some of those sublethal chronic effects? It could be suppressing the immune system. It might impact the bees' ability to go out and forage for food and remember how to find their way back to the hive and bring that food back to the hive. It impacts their learning and memory, and it also impacts their fertility. So all of these issues are terrible for a social insect that's living within a hive and a community. And it's where the research has really grown a lot in the last few years to show that we shouldn't just be looking at how much of a dose kills the bee, but also how it impacts the bee and therefore the whole system, the whole hive. So how are bees exposed to these chemicals? There are a variety of ways, and this is because these are such widespread contaminants. Like I said, neonics are systemic, so when the bees are foraging, they can be exposed to them in the pollen and nectar. Contaminated water bodies. Bees drink water. They need to go visit puddle surfaces. They like warm water, so they'll go visit surface puddles on soil in agricultural fields, which will also be contaminated with neonics, or dew droplets. And another big issue is contaminated dust from seeds that are actually coated in these chemicals. Bees can fly through the dust, or the dust settles on nearby wildflowers that bees visit, and I'll get into that issue in a little bit. But I also, a lot of people ask, well, I don't understand how are neonics so different? Because people normally think of an insecticide application as something you spray on your crops. But we actually are using neonics in ways that we never used insecticides before, and a big part of that is as a seed coating. So traditionally, we're used to seeing the foliar sprays, whether it's in agricultural settings or in landscape applications. But with neonics, we're actually coating seeds in the chemical so that as the plant grows, the chemical can be taken up into the plant, which is very inefficient, we've learned, as only about 92% of the, only 2 to 6% of the chemical is actually getting up into the plant, and the rest of it is just going off into the environment, contaminating the soil and waterways. We also do soil drenching. We directly inject them into tree trunks so that the tree contains the chemicals, and we sprinkle them on our soil. So these are all the types of applications of neonics that we're using them. And a really important point, I can't get into this, I just want to note though, there's been a lot of research recently showing that as a seed coating, which is a very big use of neonics, they're not even helping farmers in a lot of cases. It's estimated that about 95 to 99% of all of the corn seed is coated with the neonic, and a vast majority of our other annual field crops. That's a really big problem because we're essentially coating them onto the seeds, growing hundreds of millions of acres with, on top of all these other applications. And there's been really good research to show that in a lot of instances, not only are they not improving the yields of the crops, but they're actually doing more harm than good because they're wiping out beneficial insects in the area, such as natural pest predators that might be able to keep slugs under control from damaging crops. And there's a whole ecosystem. Sylvia talked yesterday about a whole systems approach, and that's really apparent with the neonic issue, that we're just not seeing the bigger picture here. And garden and landscape problems. So it's not all agriculture. Agriculture is, of course, a huge issue with neonics, and it's the biggest use of neonics, especially with seed coatings. But garden and landscape, we use a lot of these products in those settings as well. And it's just as concerning for those applications. It's estimated that there's over 500 different neonic products on the market today. It's probably much higher if you now count in all the other types of systemic insecticides that are being approved that aren't neonics. And this is just a graph showing a correlation between the honeybee population declines and the spike in uses of neonics over the years. So like I said, the first neonic came onto the market in the early 1990s, but the majority of them came onto the market in the mid-2000s when we started approving them for uses as seed coatings. And it was around the mid-2000s that a lot of commercial beekeepers across the country started reporting abnormal losses. Their hives just weren't as healthy, and that continues to be the case today as we improve more and more of these. To show this a different way in a very powerful visual, at least for me, this is going to be a series of graphs showing the increase in uses of the oldest neonicotinoid chemical, imidacloprid. That was the first one that came onto the market here in the US, and it's still in use today. So this little spots that you see across the map, that's how much land this chemical is being applied to in 1994. This is 2004, 2009, and 2011. That's just one of the neonicotinoid chemicals, and that's not even one that's used as a primary chemical as a seed coating. So if you look at the charts for the other neonicotinoid chemicals, they're just as concerning. Okay, so I said I would give an overview, general synopsis. So why does this matter? Well, everyone knows pollination services are critical to agriculture. This is a really good stunt that a Whole Foods store in Rhode Island did a few years ago, where they basically pulled all of the produce out of the produce section that would be lost if we didn't have bees. And in some areas, and this is a powerful visual from an area in China, where they've been had to resort to hand pollinating their crops. Almonds. Almonds are 100% dependent upon bees for pollination. And in California, we provide the vast majority of almonds to the world. People love almond milk and almond products. And right now, a lot of the beekeepers, and Bill will probably speak about this, truck their hives out to California just to meet the demands for pollination every February. It's estimated that we need about 1.5 to 2 million honeybee colonies just for California almond pollination. But there's only about 2.5 million hives in the country. And then they have to be trucked across the whole country just so we can keep up with the demand for our food crops. But beyond food, this is also important because, as we've heard already several times, bees are an indicator species. So they're indicating all these other larger environmental problems at play. And just to touch on some of the really good work that a lot of our colleagues have done, impacts to bird species, especially migratory bird species who depend on a lot of insects and aquatic ecosystems that are being impacted by uses of these chemicals. We're seeing impacts, as I mentioned, to beneficial insects, things that are natural pest predators that help us not need to rely on pesticides to control pest outbreaks. And research is now showing impacts to humans and other mammals. So mammalian toxicity concerns are, I think, where the research is heading, and a very important one. And bees are not the only ones that are experiencing problems from neonics. All sorts of species are, some that I just mentioned, but perhaps is also most prominent, monarch butterfly declines. Monarch butterflies decline by 90% in about 20 years. It's a very, very drastic drop. The graph down there kind of shows the decline in the monarch butterflies overwintering population that's counted in Mexico every year. And a number of groups, including Center for Food Safety, have petitioned for the monarch butterfly to be listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act because it's declined so much. But there's been a lot of research that's coming out, and just a few papers recently, showing that neonics are actually impacting monarch butterflies as well. And this is important because a lot of the monarch discussion so far has focused on issues with herbicides, namely glyphosate, and herbicides wiping out a critical milkweed habitat that monarch butterflies need to survive. But what we hadn't been researching and really looking into more was the impacts of insecticides on butterflies, especially monarchs. So this is really important, showing now that not only are, it's like a 1-2 punch, not only are monarchs being impacted by the loss of their breeding habitat from herbicides killing the plants, but they're also being impacted by insecticides, which impact both the larvae and the adult butterflies. But the good news is that there's a lot of action happening, both internationally and here in the US, which I'll just go through as quickly as possible. International action, Richard earlier mentioned the European Union's moratorium on uses of neonics. That's a 2-year moratorium, which we're hoping they'll extend on the uses of 3 of the most toxic neonics. But prior to that, several countries had taken action to restrict these chemicals independently. So the New York Times article, actually in the packet that you were all provided, that's discussing some of the research still coming out of Europe, trying to support extending that moratorium to prevent more uses of these chemicals from going onto the market there. There's been legal action, which Sylvia discussed last night. This is one of Center for Food Safety's cases that she discussed. Bill is our plaintiff in this case, one of our plaintiffs, and congressional action. There's a really good bill in Congress right now. It's kind of the beacon of hope that we're really focusing on trying to get a lot of support for, called the Saving America's Pollinators Act, which was first introduced in 2013, actually shortly after that massive bumblebee kill incident I showed earlier. And right now we're working on getting more co-sponsors on that bill. It would seek to suspend uses of the 4 most toxic neonics, so in a way kind of mirror what the European Union has done, and do that here. Nichelle mentioned the presidential memorandum. This is really important because there's a lot of opportunity here for our government to take strong action on these chemicals, and we hope that they do. We've been spending a lot of time putting pressure on the White House to do the right thing and actually restrict, suspend, ban, do anything, take meaningful action on neonics. So we're expecting that any day. And there's actually been really great action out of government agencies. This is last year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that they'd be banning neonics and restricting GE crops in all national wildlife refuges, which is huge. This is just a couple of quotes from the Fish and Wildlife Service memo. I love that the precautionary approach is mentioned in this. We make this decision based on a precautionary approach to our wildlife management practices and not on agricultural practices, especially important considering that research is showing these are not providing a benefit in the agricultural setting. And then, of course, lots of grassroots action. So these are some photos from a rally that we did in DC, I think 3 years ago. We had beekeepers drive down trucks of empty beehives to the Environmental Protection Agency building in Washington, DC. We rallied outside of that. The nearby bees, we suspect from the White House, ended up I guess robber bees, and they ended up following the truck around DC, which kind of ticked off some of the agency police. Lots of action at the marketplace arena. We've been really putting a lot of pressure on Home Depot and Lowe's with groups like Beyond Pesticides, Pesticide Action Network, Friends of the Earth, and many, many more to take these products off their shelves, to stop treating the plants that they sell in their stores with these products, because a lot of people say, well, I want to help bees, I want to go plant pollinator-friendly flowers, and they go and buy pollinator-friendly flowers from Lowe's or Home Depot, and there have been studies showing that those plants are actually treated with neonics and not labeled as such, so it's a very big problem. And we've been rallying at the White House. We just delivered 4 million signatures to the White House, asking them to take meaningful action on bees outside of EPA again. We tend to spend a lot of time at EPA. And Nichelle mentioned local action. So there's been really tremendous action all over the country at the local level in the absence of federal action. And I think that that's really inspiring. And I think we're seeing a lot of hope for this because people do care about this issue. They recognize the importance of pollinators and what this means for our broader environment and our own health. And they are taking action into their own hands. So whether it's with local resolutions at the local level to restrict uses of these chemicals on public property, or whether it's a number of neighborhoods and homes joining together pledging not to use these chemicals within their community, there's been a lot of mobilization at the local level. Universities taking action as well to prevent these chemicals from being used, and this is a lot of what we're doing with our Be Protective campaign that Nichelle mentioned earlier.
I'll just go ahead and quickly reintroduce our next speaker, Dr. Richard Callahan. He is the director of the Worcester County Bee Association in Massachusetts and the co-author of several honeybee studies. So welcome again.
During this little talk, I was going to focus a little more about what we really need to do, or what you might do as activists. Kind of coming up with some of my own experience. I've started working with pesticides in 1963. I doubt there were many of you alive. And I've worked with some people that really have done some significant things in the environmental movement. So I thought I'd just give you a little history about what they experienced, and that an awful lot of what we're seeing now is kind of the same old, but it's the same kind of thing. And I think it tells us that really the right way to go in the end is to start fixing a system or reforming a system and making it work for the long term. And when DDT and the chlorinated hydrocarbons were banned, there was a real movement, and EPA got started, and a lot of things are really moving. We've fallen back an awful lot since, I'd say, about the 80s. And we're right back to where we were almost at the beginning, because EPA really just isn't doing the job anymore. So it's kind of like they're not there. Environmental contamination is not a new problem. And I give some lists here. I mean, there's real, since man started industrializing and mining, we've been poisoning things because we've been taking lead and arsenic and a number of things out of the ground. So we have been continually trying to battle that. one of the people, a real hero, and most of you probably never heard of him, was Claire Patterson, who was at Caltech. I happened to work with Claire for 4 or 5 years in the 70s. Claire was a man who actually dated the Earth. All right, he's a geophysicist, brilliant guy. Mass spectrometry was really the tool. He was of tremendous capability. And the way you date the Earth is you look at isotopes of lead and ratios of that to isotopes of uranium. So he had to find clean samples of naturally occurring mineral lead. And what he found out was, because he could tell by the different isotope ratios what was clean and what wasn't, he couldn't find clean. Things were thousands of times higher than they were supposed to be in lead contamination. And this led him to believe, and really know, that we were actually approaching lethal levels of lead in humans. And he went on a campaign to get lead out of things. And we had lead in gasoline. It was just, imagine, tetraethyl lead in gasoline, you start your car up, lead comes shooting out the back end of your gas, of your pipe. I mean, you know, the lead contamination was incredible. We had lead paint all over houses. People were packing it on. We had lead actually soldered the inside of cans that you had food in. The seam was lead solder. So lead was everywhere. And guys my age, you know, I've got a lot more lead in my bones than you young folks have. And the person that you got to thank for that is really Claire Patterson. What happened to him was the industry, the Ethel Corporation, which was a conglomerate formed by General Motors and Esso. General Motors at that time was the biggest corporation in the world in the 50s. What they did is they attempted to blackball his funding. They attacked his scientific and personal reputation. I mean, just, you know, he told me he had things like, he had death threats. You know, he'd go to give a talk, and at 11 o'clock at night, there'd be a knock on his door. He'd go there, and there'd be some young lady there, well paid for, asking him if she could come in. And they were trying to do everything they could to undermine this guy and to discredit him. They produced data to just muddy the waters as far as he was claiming that the natural levels of lead were very low. They were saying they were, you know, 1,000 times higher than he was claiming. He proved his point. They engaged contract scientists to just simply generate data that would contradict what he was putting out, and they just lobbied DC in every direction, a lot of money. And for about 20 years, Claire just hammered away, a very stubborn guy, and he won out. Today, the lead concentrations in human blood are down 80%. The environmental pollution by lead as measured in the Arctic snow and ice is down orders of magnitude, and the Ethel Corporation is gone. Rachel Carson did much the same thing. We've heard a lot about Rachel, and I guess most of you, I hope you've read her book, absolutely seminal. Certainly changed my life. I was a junior in college when she published, and I read Silent Spring and really went into grad school with the idea of looking at pesticides. And that's what I did in my graduate work. She was against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. She really wasn't for getting rid of them totally. She wanted them highly regulated. She believed the USDA was not doing the job, and in fact they have a conflict of interest, and she's absolutely right. They still have it today. Their mission is to help farmers, you know, grow crops cheaply, and that's in conflict with, you know, regulating the sustainable use of chemicals in the environment. And she really was responsible for getting the EPA movement going, and she talked about true IPM type of management. What happened to her? I was there. I mean, I was at that time I was active in this. Personal attacks on the papers, intense industry lobbying against her, legal attempts to stop her publications, distortions, statements, just the same old, right? It's gone on and on. So what can we expect as we continually work to do this kind of thing? And that's, you're going to get this kind of pushback. And I think this is a statement that originally came from the Sierra Club, at least that's where I heard it, that a statesman is a politician who stands up straight because he's under equal, or she is under equal pressures from all sides. Industry is going to always push And the establishment that has products are always going to push one way. And if you're going to get any kind of rational behavior, you have to push back. I would, in my own experience, advise you that when somebody is talking to you emotionally based appeals, suspect what they're talking about. Science is a very objective business. All right? If they haven't got the data, suspect what they're talking about. And that can actually occur on the environmental side also. There are people that will just say everything's bad simply because they don't really have the data. Ask for data. I would suggest that in the short term, usually you want to try to get some incremental improvements year to year, day to day. You know, a long journey starts with one step. You can sometimes get revolutionary change, but usually you're better off taking the incremental data, which sometimes means compromising a little bit, but you get some progress that's possible. In the long term, change the strategy and the whole system, and that can be done. Anything can be done in time. So it's important to have long-term plans on what really needs to be changed in the long term, and organizations like Beyond Pesticides and other places look at those. I know Jay does that, and just make sure that you are going to get there in a step-by-step basis. Talk about the neonics. I think it's important to understand. I'm sorry. There's something missing. No, something's got mixed up in my slides. The advantages, I think it's important to understand that from a farmer's point of view, the neonics, if you're only looking at what I can produce this year, the neonics are terrific pesticides. You don't have to go and spray them. They're relatively safe to handle because the acute toxicity of humans is a lot lower. You buy the seed coated very often and just plant it, and that's the end of pesticide problems. You've got root protection, stem protection, leaf protection, fruit protection. It's in the what's called the therapeutic index. The toxicity to insects versus the toxicity to humans there's a huge difference, so that they have very high tolerance levels. However, in the disadvantages are enormous also. They're persistent in soils, they migrate, they're polluting water, they cause behavioral dysfunctions that I'm talking about, as I talked about earlier, in honeybees and certainly in other insects. They're causing enormous, and you think of the food web, the number of insects is just going down enormously. So the food web issue is enormous. And because of inadequate licensing requirements, and the overuse and the misuse is enormous. So we're really looking, I think, at an environmental disaster very shortly. So I would suggest that, and this is just my own personal opinion, so other people here may have better ones and have different opinions. But I think in the short term, that cosmetic uses should be just banned. There's no reason to have a perfect lawn to be getting rid of Japanese beetle grubs in your lawn by spreading neonics all over the place. You don't need them in your roses and flowers. So I think that's something that can be achieved. I think it could be done immediately, and it would have a big effect on urban and suburban areas. I think that for agricultural uses, and there are many organizations Ontario is looking as one area that's looking to do this, is to start managing neonics as an application of last resort. And Ontario was talking about requiring farmers to go through actually very, very strenuous applications to be able to use neonics. And once they require that, that's going to actually lead to the ban, I believe, very soon, because an awful lot of the advantages of neonics go away. The big advantage to farmers is they're just so easy to use. And if they make it harder to use, then it gives openings for other things. And then, of course, the research should be required to really understand these behavioral dysfunction problems. If you don't understand the mechanism, you don't understand the safety. I think long-term, what we should be doing is not allow industry to sponsor data to be actually used for licensing. Require industry, I think you should require industry to fund the licensing, but go through EPA, which should be acting as a filter, as a third party, and have a lot of universities and people doing research that is independent, totally independent of the industry. Very important to, and I think our work shows this, require multi-generation life cycle studies on multiple species. I'd include bees, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, but other species also, prior to licensing. There should be a couple of different species of insects. There should be then species of crustaceans, fish, and just right up the food web, so that you have an idea of what these chemicals are likely to do in the environment before you license them. Once they're licensed, and you've got millions of dollars, and actually billions of dollars, tied up in using a chemical, agricultural practices have changed around that chemical, the problems of getting it back off the market are astronomical. If you get rid of the problem, if you screen these things properly, you'll have many fewer of these problems. USDA should be separated from the whole licensing, and that is supposed to be done now, but when you actually serve on EPA committees, what that you'll find in the room on the same committee with you are people from USDA that are cooperating with EPA, which sounds like a nice thing, but it actually is a real bias. So there's one other issue that I think is worth my background was starting technology companies once I got out of, I had about a 30-year period when I really started. I got out of doing environmental work and I was running companies. And so and these are technology companies, so I think I have some insight in how entrepreneurs go in and develop new technology and what motivates them to develop new technology that will help you get beyond pesticides. We really need to change the whole paradigm. You don't want to come up with the next new nerve poison. I mean, this is not the way to do it. There's got to be other very different ways of doing this. The only way that you are going to get to do that is to show the sublethal effects or the downsides of the present system, so that entrepreneurs that are looking at this say, well, if I can come up and give the same kind of good effect, but come up without having the downside, then in fact I got a way to really make some money and be successful. That's the way the system works. And by covering up the downsides and not talking about it, which the USDA has actually done very effectively through their research programs on bees. What they really did is came up and threw money at people that were doing research on bees, many of them good people, and said, well, we got to take a look at nutrition. We've got to take a look at the effects of viruses. We've got to take a look at the effects of other parasites. But we aren't going to look at, you can't find USDA funding neonicotinoid research. They do very little or none of it. So it's by simply buying the attention of people away from the problem, they've persisted and kept this going and kept other entrepreneurs from the ability to come in and actually come up with better ways of doing things. So I want to thank you for that, and I hope I answered some of your questions. I'll be glad to talk about you later.
Our next and final speaker is from right here in Florida, Bill Rhodes. He is also the owner of Bill Rhodes Honey. So welcome.
My name is Bill Rhodes, and I've been in the bee business since 1973, about 42 years. I started out with 400 hives of bees the first year. And if you can believe this or not, we hand loaded them. We didn't have loaders. Loaders weren't even on the scene, really, hardly. And we went to Wisconsin with them, made a crop of honey, came back, made some more bees. Before I knew it, I had 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, on up the scale. After the Wisconsin venture, we went to North Dakota for about 25 years sharecropping. That's where the sharecropper pays half the freight for the bees that go up there, gets half the honey, split it 50-50. 1998, we decided to go ahead and buy a business in South Dakota. It was registered locations. I think we had about 160 or 70 or something like that. And Anyway, but we go to 4 honey crops: the orange blossom, gallberry palmetto, clover in South Dakota, and the pepper back in Florida. The point I'm trying to make, in 2005, we had 6,500 hives and we were going to 10,000. And what we were trying to do was run 6,500 hives in South Dakota, keep the 3,500 or so here in Florida for the citrus growers the following year. And the bees from South Dakota were going straight to California for pollination and on the almonds. And that's what some of the bigger guys were doing. They were putting them in stock yards and keeping them there until they moved them in the almonds. Well, it made sense. That same beehive, if I brought it back to Florida, I was paying $5,000, $6,000 in freight to get it back. But I went straight to California with it and cut that one expense out. Then we had to move the bees straight out of the holding yards into the orchards in California. Well, my foreman called me, and we were talking, and he said, Bill, he said, the bees just don't look right. This is in 2005, October, November. Well, you got to understand, bees, the queens, the days are getting shorter. The queens are going to quit laying going into wintertime. And I said, that's got to be it, Scott. I said, we just made 2,600 drums of honey back then, which was pretty darn good. And I said, what could be wrong with the bees? I said, you've treated them for mites. You've put an extra gallon of syrup on them, fed them. I said, ship them. They've got to be okay. Well, we got about 6 loads there, and the broker called me and said, Bill, there's something wrong with your bees. So I said, well, we'll fly out there and look at them and see what we can find. 4 of us flew out there. We got out there, and you could not believe it. You would see bees that you would mark one day. We were there like for 7 or 8 days. You'd mark them one day and come back in 2 days, and the bees were gone, or half of them are gone. Just disappeared. There's no dead bees on the ground. They're gone. Well, make a long story short, I sent 15 semi-loads of bees to California that year. I got paid for 2. So I don't know exactly what the freight was then, but it's $7,000 one way right now. So say it's somewhere close to shipping them out there and shipping them back to Florida, $10,000 a load, $12,000 a load, I don't know. But I lost all that money. And but the thing that stuck in my mind, you could not find any dead bees. They just disappeared. They flew off and never came back. Well, that year we lost about 4,500 hives, and then there hasn't been a year since then we haven't lost at least that many, but 2008 sticks out because the bees came back. We quit California. Nobody would even talk to us because they said, well, you're a piss poor beekeeper. You know, you don't know what happened to your bees. I said, well. So in 2008, we decided we were going to split 3 semi-loads of bees. That's about 1,350 hives. In other words, you're going to split them, make 2,700 out of them. We split those bees, and you couldn't tell if there was anything wrong with them. I mean, they had plenty of brood, plenty of bees, and we got them back to Florida. We split them, trying to get our numbers back up. Every hive died. You couldn't believe it. We had no idea what it was. Well, we had an idea in 2008 because we'd gone online and Googled bear, gaucho, and bees and found out what happened in Europe. But anyway, but that one semi-load of bees we brought in there in 2008, I think it came in about the 10th of October. I sent the crew out there. We treated them for mites, fed them antibiotics, fed them, and I told them, I said, don't touch those bees until I tell you to. Leave them right there on that holding yard. In 60 days, there was not a bee alive. And, you know, we're trying to get the state of Florida there to come pull samples. They pull samples. I don't know what they were looking for, but they couldn't find anything wrong with the bees. So anyway, back to California again. We started in 2013, realizing we had to include California in the business just because of the money, the potential to make a lot of money in a short window. So we started out with 8 semi-loads of bees, which is about 4,000 hives, give or take 1 or 2. Sent them out there. Everything was great. It was like, man, old home week, things were rolling. We got the bees back here. They looked beautiful. They were full of bees, full of brood, full of everything. Took them up to the Galberry Woods the next step, and I don't know what happened. Bees started disappearing again. We normally run bee yards, and they're normally about 120 in a yard for a convenience factor more than anything else, the way the trucks are set up. But we got those bees back, and we're pulling the honey off of them. If you had a group of 160, you would find 20 or 30 hives full of honey, 120 pounds of honey, no bees in them. But the strangest thing was the bees wouldn't rob them. There was something there that they wouldn't rob them. Because normally bees, after a honey flow, you can trigger them rob. I mean, they start killing each other. So the second year, which was last year, and then the other thing was a lot of those bees that didn't die had adverse effects also. I mean, the bees were dwindling down. So anytime that happens, it's hard to increase your numbers if you don't have good, healthy bees. All right, this last year, not 2014, first load of bees we got off, we unloaded them, and some of the men were looking at them. They brought me a frame and showed it to me. I was running one of the loaders, and here's a whole frame of brood with the bees with their tongues sticking out, dead. Pesticide poisoning. So we started looking at every dadgum load as it came in, and I described it. I sent some pictures out, and how I described it. We had 10 semi-loads last year, 4,800 hives. And another point I'm going to make too, well, I had to buy 1,000 hives to make 4,800 last year. So I was down to 3,800 hives from where I used to have 10,000. Bees were dying. I mean, you could see them drawing brood out, bringing it out in front of the hives. I mean, bees shaking, everything. Called the state of Florida, said, come down here and look at this. I got a pesticide poisoning. What they did, they didn't tell me what they were going to do. I just assumed what they were going to do. They took samples and ran them for viruses. I mean, you can see the poisoning right there. I mean, everybody saw it. So they said, well, we didn't really find anything. So my backup was Susan Kegley in California. I pulled samples, kept them, sent them to her. And what we found out, nobody wanted to admit it, but the growers were taking a, I might be wrong here now, they were taking a fungicide that they knew killed bees, but it wasn't marked on the label, and mixing it with an insect growth regulator. And then spraying it on the almonds in full bloom, which you can't believe anybody be that stupid. But I don't know. My description of the bees, out of the 4,800, I think I wrote down 20% look normal, 60% look like they've lost half their bees, and the other 20% are dead. So now you're backed into a corner again because you don't have anything to draw from, to make your splits from. You got a bunch of sick bees, and I think we might have made up 600 splits off 600 hives that probably weren't even qualified to do it, but we had to do it to try to make up losses. Well, here we come up to 2015. I buy $340,000 in bees. And my wife's starting to question my judgment, you know, like, this might not be the right thing to do. I said, well, you know, I've always been a fighter, and this is what we're going to do. And knock on wood, the bees came back, and they look great. So hopefully they don't die. But and another thing was I went ahead and sold my South Dakota operation to my foreman because we had enough yards there that he could put bees on that didn't have, well, I missed this point. When we first bought South Dakota in 1998, there was no corn, speak of. There was no soybeans. There's a little sunflower, but it was mostly CRP land set aside, and it was full of clover, sweet clover, and alfalfa. It was just a natural habitat for bees to make honey. And a normal crop there, or a decent crop, was 160-pound average. An average crop was 120, and a below average crop was 70 or 80. Those 4 honey flows that we went to every year, we would always hit 2 out of the 4 somewhere. You'd make honey in Florida, you'd make it in South Dakota or something. We have never made a crop of honey off anything since 2005, if you can believe that. As a matter of fact, I don't even think we made 1,000 drums of honey this past year. I don't believe, but thank God for California, and hopefully they don't keep killing the bees. But there's some things out there that I was showing it to Larissa a while ago that just kind of get under my skin. Bayer came out with this product, Premise, for termites. And I call it a murder mystery. They tell you exactly how they're going to do it, but you can't do anything about it. But it affects social insects that groom themselves or feed themselves or feed each other or whatever. But I mean, it's right there in writing, and they even got videos to show you how it kills them. Well, termites, basically a bee almost. They live in a colony and they act like bees. I mean, they groom themselves and each other, and that was one of them. Then another thing, an event that stuck out in my mind, I mean, this thing is about big money. That's all it's about. And you're trying to take somebody's money away from them, they're trying to put up a fight. And I'm referring to Bayer, Syngenta, and some of these companies. I mean, they're making billions of dollars off of us. And then you got guys like Jeff Pettis and Dennis Van Engelsdorf that go over to Europe or go to France to the big beekeeper meeting there at Apimondia, and they get up on a podium and announce to the world that we discovered what's killing the bees. Neonics. They come back to the States and have to recant the story. Have to deny they said it. They're not deny they said it. They have to, I forgot what reason they used, but it was ridiculous. And then this past summer, Dr. Bernaccio had a release that he came over and got some prestigious award from the National Academy of Sciences or something, but his study showed that neonics at 1 part per billion suppress the bee's immune system, which I thought, my gosh, that explains a lot of things. 1 part per billion? I mean, the bees are getting it through dust, they're getting it through pollen, they're getting it through water in the streams, the lakes, the mud holes, whatever. And let's see. I've got a friend right here in Vero Beach that's, he's not a hobbyist beekeeper, but he has 100 hives or 200 hives of bees. And he's down here in Vero Beach, right in the center of what we call the St. Johns River Marsh, which is about 50,000 acres, and it's bordered by the St. Johns River Marsh. And one of the big growers there, Premier Citrus, is killing these bees. They've killed them 3 different occasions. The second time, Bayer sent Dick Rogers, I think, sent Dick Rogers there. He pulled samples and came back at 2,425 parts per billion in the bees. Well, I mean, I don't know what acute kill, what it takes, 40, 50, 100 parts per billion, I don't know. But it killed his bees. And, of course, they claimed it was impossible. Well, it was possible because they even told him the numbers. This was clothianidin. Now, this is another type of systemic pesticide that's probably even more potent than the imidacloprid, the one we're talking about. But, and then they did it a 3rd time. And he has the state of Florida go down there, pull samples. They can't find anything. Of course, they showed up 7 days late to pull the samples. Maybe it broke down, I don't know. But the most important thing about that was They tested leaves on the trees of the orange trees, the orange grove. 22,000 parts per billion in those leaves. And we were at a meeting up here at Gainesville about a month ago. Bob and I were talking with AES guy, which is our form of the EPA. His name was Stephen Gwinnell, and he's like the #2 in command, I guess, up in Tallahassee. And he was trying to sell us on how good this stuff was going to be. But why would you put imidacloprid Admire Pro into an orange grove that's already infected with the greening, and you have no hope of killing it? It doesn't make sense. But they went ahead and did it. And there's some other thing I wanted to tell you there, and I've done just slipped my mind now. But the other thing was, 22,000 parts per billion, and Larissa's telling you that it migrates through the plant, whatever it is. My question to Stephen Gwinnell, when he got up there and talked in front of everybody, I said, Stephen, I'm sure you took samples of the oranges to see how much was in the orange juice, didn't you? He looked at me and looked like he'd seen a ghost, never said another word about it at all. Shut up. And which we're trying to get in there now. If you can believe this, they got, I don't know if it's armed guards or guards on the front gate of that grove, Premier Citrus, which they're probably, if you thought Ben Hill Griffin was big, these people are bigger than Ben Hill Griffin. The Lawrence group, the Lawrence family. These are some pictures that we sent around of what bees look like. All right, there's some of the dead bees in front of the hives there they've been dragging out. These bees were just unloaded from California. Some of these pictures could have been taken in the Gallberry Woods too. There's one that's completely dead. But you notice we run a 1.5-story hive. That's mostly a food chamber up on top. They have a little bit of brood in there, but basically a food chamber. It's kind of like having money in the bank for a rainy day. If you get them somewhere too early and you have to feed them, they've got stores inside that super right there. Thank you.
So before we get into questions and answers, if I could have the panelists come to the front, and then we could take questions from there.
When we treat our bees with neonicotinoids, purposely at low levels, we find that they're normal all summer, and then around December they start to leave the hives, and between December and March they're gone. Mm-hmm. And my question was, when you've seen this just in the field, and not so much from pesticides where the bees die in the hive, but when they actually leave, is that happening in the winter or late fall, or is it any time of year?
It's normally happening when we get the bees back from South Dakota when you see it. And you have to understand, by going to that 1.5-store hive, that operation, you don't have to manage the bees. I mean, they just kind of take care of themselves. If we lost 5% a year, it was amazing. We would run bees to South Dakota and bring them back in. And you wouldn't hardly pick up a hive. We checked every one for eggs. I mean, the crew would. And if you found a queenless hive, it still had plenty of bees in. You give it 2 frames of brood and a queen, it's going again. Sure. I mean, but you didn't have these big die-outs. And the problem is you don't have nothing to work with. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to have to buy next year. I mean, don't get me wrong. If I don't have any problems with these bees from California, I'll be back to 9,000 again shortly. But if I got problems, it's going to be the other way. But the last 2 years, I mean, if you'd have told me that first year I went back to California that there was something wrong with those bees, I'd had to just argue with you, disagree with you. I'd never seen such good-looking bees. I mean, and made honey. You talking about a hive that made 120 pounds of honey, and there's not a bee in the hive? I mean, it's like, damn, what's going on? This is really nice. You don't have to worry about getting stung, but it ain't good when you gotta have bees,
Do you see a relationship between the chemical use of neonics and the vulnerability or increased vulnerability to varroa mite? Do you see any relationship there? Could you repeat that?
Well, I mean, I may not be the best person here to answer this, but in our experimental work, first I think that it makes sense that, you know, if I've got pneumonia and I've also got malaria and I've also undernourished, I'm not going to do as well as someone who's just got pneumonia. So there's no question there's a relationship between all these things. But I think is the biggest problem that we have in the Northeast for bees is varroa mite kills more hives than anything else. If you don't manage varroa very well, you're going to lose your hive, and where we are. And I think there's very little question in my mind that they're also vectoring viruses, though I haven't seen anybody really prove that, but it just makes sense that they would, because it's the kind of thing that would be a great vector. But there's also no question that neonicotinoids are pesticides are really killing bees.
So Jay's question was if there's a relationship between the varroa mite and neonics, and I think it's really important. Bill touched on it, you touched on it. The synergistic effects with pesticides and all of those other factors that are affecting bees, varroa mite being one of them, are definitely there, and we need more research on it. But Bill mentioned social insects like to groom themselves. Bees need to groom themselves as well. They'll groom themselves to keep the varroa mite at bay and, you know, try and keep the mites out of the hive. And if they're exposed to neonicotinoids, which affect their central nervous system and their ability to remember and learn, then that's going to affect their ability to remember how to groom themselves and to take care of themselves better. And I think that that's a really important point.
Jay, I could tell you stories that you would think I had to be lying to you about mites and you know, their effects on bees and what you use to kill them. Like I said, it's about the dollar. That's all it's about. Bayer, who was the maker of Apistan? Oh, let me finish this one little thing here 1 second. Marianne Fraser and her group went to East Africa to study bees over there, and they were looking at mites and viruses, but the bees were thriving. I mean, you've seen this article before?
Yeah, and the varroa mite's been around in the U.S. since the mid-1980s,
wait,
right?
Let me finish. Yeah, you're right. The only thing they don't have is neonics, which suppress the bee's immune system. 25 miles right over here, I saw the first varroa mite back in 1986 in Larry Bergman's bees. You treated 2 or 3 times a year, something like that. Now, Florida, you have to treat more because your bees don't go broodless. In other words, up north, they go broodless. It's much easier to kill the mites if they're attached to the bee. If they're inside the brood, it's harder to kill them. I don't know if I'll just touch on this. I don't want to say too much about it because it gets long and drawn out. We had a strip when they first came out, Apistan strip, Section 18 strip, and we used it for that year, and we were told to destroy that strip. It was, I forgot what the reason was, but they wanted you to destroy it. And they had a newer version out they wanted to sell you. Well, that Section 18 strip wiped the mites out now, I'm going to tell you. Well, the newer version, they changed the plasticizer where you had to buy more strips. Oh, it would kill them, but only a short period of time. So I had some bees one time that, well, just forget that. That's too long a story. But it makes well, anyway. But anyway, let's go on to check mite. You ever heard of check mite before? White strip. Came out, Bayer produced it. Came out, and I'm going to tell you what. We cut them in half. And I told my men, I said, just drag the strip through the bee yard. It'll kill the mites. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. But we watch our bees. Every honey flow, we're looking at them, rolling them, looking for mites to see what the levels are. Well, you know, your bees come back from South Dakota. They've been there for 3 or 4 months, and you're rolling 6, 8, or 10, something like that, something fairly low. Shit, I got another brain. But we put the strips in them, sent them off to the honey flow down in South Florida, brought them back. They got the same numbers. We pulled the strips out, sent them over to ABC Labs. Tell me what the difference is in these strips. Well, they got another plasticizer. They got something that releases all the chemical at one time in 7 days. Well, you're not killing all the mites in the brood. They wanted to make more money. It's not about helping you stay in business. It's how do we make more money? And of course, that's the bottom line in any business. But you know, somebody like me that doesn't realize you've done it, and if you do it and you tell me, then I can prepare for it. But if you don't tell me, it's tough. Did I answer your question? I don't know.
Well, you know, when we work on policy and we bring the science to policymakers, the industry is constantly pointing to Australia as the example of why it's not neonates.
Well, most of the honey in Australia, people that get into where they're row cropping or whatever, they have problems with the neonics. But most of the guys are in the bush making honey, from what I've understood and seeing them.
Exactly. Exactly. So they don't have pollination services like yet, like they do here. I mean, that's the theory on our side, but the industry's coming into state legislatures and local policy discussions and saying, Australia proves that it's not neonics because they don't have a varroamide problem, they use neonics, and therefore it's not neonics.
I would suggest not focusing on necessarily only bee deaths from neonics, which is obviously a big problem. But when you've got these behavioral changes in insects, they're happening all over the insects. What's it doing to the food web? What's it doing to monarchs? This stuff is a disaster. And by mechanisms nobody understands. So they need to be regulated in a very strict way, at the least. I think one comment I'd make also is that, you know, when you use the scientific method to try to look at a problem, what you usually do in recognizing that life is complicated and there are many factors that going on at once, but usually the first step is when you're in high school algebra and somebody gave you a great big equation. What did they have? What was the first step to solving a great big equation? First step is factor the equation. You get it into the simplest form. All right. Then you go and you solve for X and Y and Z separately, one at a time. You learn about them things one at a time. Then you start looking at interactions. If you don't understand, you know, trying to look at and what USDA has done and with you know, industry guidance is decide that you have to solve every problem at once, so that you have to look at nutrition, viruses, varroa. They don't really fund much on pesticides. And all these people have got to, you know, simultaneously solve this equation and without solving one unknown at a time and then looking for interactions. And what they've done really is bought an awful lot of researchers. You know, I'll fund your nutrition study, I'll fund your viral study, I'll fund this and that, but we are funding neonics. And you look at we have people come and talk to us all the time about their nutrition studies and stuff, and it's really a cabal of people just plain passing out money, so you don't look at what the real problems are. And it's scandalous.
This is for Bill, and I thank you for telling your story. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you think the future of beekeeping is going to be in the United States if we don't address this issue.
It is so scary. I mean, everybody's mentioned water. 95% of the poison goes back into the ground, like only 5% is in the uptake. I don't know. I think we're killing ourselves. We just haven't figured it out yet. I mean, I've got 2 sons, they're about 40 years old, and I'm going to tell you, they're intelligent kids. But they're always telling me, if I tell them something, they say, well, call me, remind me tomorrow, Dad. I'm thinking, damn, I mean, it's scary. Remind me tomorrow. You can't remember what I told you today till tomorrow? I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's a new generation. I don't know. But the thing scares me. You know, I don't know what it's doing to us. I don't know if anybody knows, but I sure wish somebody tried to find out what it's doing to us.
What is any of your opinion on the importation of bees? Because I hear that the bee population is so stressed in the U.S. that they actually have to resort to importing bees. Is there, other than the time shift and the lots of lattes and cappuccinos have to drink to get used to the time shift, is there a problem with, what is the inherent problem with importing bees, in your opinion? What's the biggest problem, other than cost?
You know, I can't even really say something intelligent on that, to be honest with you. I know they don't want, I mean, of course, we didn't want the Varroa mite, and we got it. How did we get it? Most likely a queen breeder went over to Europe somewhere and stuck one on a plane and brought it back, and it had a mite on it. Yeah. But it's caused a lot of problems in the industry. But, you know, you have to realize, too, that we had 20 years there that we didn't have mite problems. It's just, it seems like it came with the introduction of neonics when the mite problem started. But I'm sure there's other diseases out there that I'm not aware about that, you know, that could be transmitted or something.
When the world was just one continent, and the number of species were a lot less because you didn't get the genetic diversity you get with isolation. Things moved apart, and these animals were isolated for millions of years. You got all the speciation now with modern, you know, just movement of goods and people and products and all. I think it's impossible to keep all these species isolated from each other. And so, I mean, we're having problems all the time, and frankly, we're giving problems. We give New World pests are going into Asia and Europe, and the Asians, and this is where really the Varroa mite problem comes from, is it was on Apis cerani, which could tolerate it, and then it jumped over to mellifera in Asia, and then mellifera came back here. So I'm not sure that isolating things, I mean, I agree that we're going to get a lot of viruses and a lot of things moving around. I just don't think you're going to keep it from happening in the long run.
So the question was about importation and what our opinions are. And I would say, you know, I think the honeybee is a very good example because it's not native to the U.S. We brought it here. We imported the honeybee. But we have 4,000 species of wild bees here, and we're not monitoring them and looking at them the same way that we are able to with honeybees because we don't have beekeepers taking care of them. You know, the beekeepers are our gauge and our eyes for what's happening with honeybees. And we're seeing these issues with spread of disease, which is a huge issue, probably the biggest issue with importation. But we have all these wild species here that are also suffering population declines and disease threats. And I think my hesitation and concern with introducing more threats wouldn't just be to issues with honeybees, but to all of these native species here and what it would do to further undermine their populations.
Another problem we have in the north, which is a kind of a mini importation problem, is we try to get locally bred populations that are better getting through the winters in the north. Because, I mean, animals adapt to their local areas, and of course shipping these around, it kind of must mix them up. But we'd like to have our own kind of locally bred bees, lots of queens, and since we're losing so many bees every winter from neonics, but probably Varroa and other things, we have to keep bringing in bees from the south. Well, that means not only I can replace that queen with my own queen like in July or August and get my normal bees back, but when they go out to breed, your virgin queens go out to breed, of course they're running into southern drones. And so you're mixing, it's very hard to get your local populations that you want to have. And in the past, that didn't happen very much. You know, the northern bees were really adapted to the north, the southern bees to the south. There wasn't, and I think that probably is part of at least a piece of the problem.